welcome back to Study with Additti. My name is Additti and this channel is dedicated to revision tips and tricks along with much more to help make your schooling life a whole lot easier. As you may be able to tell, I've got a bit of a cold, so you're going to have to excuse that. But anyway, today I'm going to be doing another economics book review, and today the book is called The Return of Depression Economics and the Crisis of 2008, and it's by Paul Krugman, who is a very well-known economist. So it was really interesting reading this book, and it covers a lot of stuff that I've done in class. So as you can see, the book is very short. I think it is probably 200 pages. Let's see. Yep, 191 pages, so it's very easy to read. As usual, I'm just going to be doing a chapter by chapter summary and then a review sort of thing where I give my own thoughts. As usual, I have notes with me, so if I look down at any point, then that is what I'm looking at. Okay, so the first chapter is called The Central Problem Has Been Solved. And this chapter talks about how the world thought that depression economics was not a thing anymore and it was just over. Robert Lucas, who won a Nobel Memorial Prize in economics, claimed that the business cycle had been tamed. And Paul Krugman talks about how capitalism remains unchallenged in today's world, and he uses a babysitting metaphor which gets introduced around this point. I think it's the Capitol Hill Babysitting Co-op, something like that. And basically it's about the idea of using coupons to babysit. If you watched my review on Yanis Varoufakis' book, Talking to My Daughter About the Economy, A Brief History of Capitalism, then you'll probably know that he uses the prisoners of war camp model. And so basically they're just both metaphors to explain how the economy functions. So yeah, that's where this gets introduced, and it's like an ongoing metaphor throughout the entire book to help put all of this economic jargon into more useful everyday language. He also talks about technology in the economy, and he also talks about globalization, basically my favourite economics topic. And he talks about the term third world and how the term wasn't actually meant to be a bad term. It was meant to represent pride, which obviously it doesn't today. So then chapter 2 is called Warning Ignored, Latin America's Crises. And this chapter just talks about Latin America's crises, including Mexico's 1994 tequila crisis, and that happened because of an overvalued exchange rate. So there was a large current account deficit, meaning that there was more money out than in. And he also goes on to talk about how economists learnt the wrong lessons from these crises, and that the same thing happened in Asia just a few years later. Basically, he's kind of throwing shade at all these economists. So the third chapter is Japan's Trap, and this chapter is slightly different from the others in its content, in the fact that Japan is a stable country where people have stable education. It's seen as an advanced economy, and for it to have a recession, it's quite out of the blue. In this chapter, Paul Krugman also talks about the concept of moral hazard, and basically what it is that certain people take risks knowing that they won't have to face the consequences. He goes on to refer to this concept again and again throughout the book, but this is where he initially introduces it. And basically what happened in Japan was that there was a liquidity trap, and a liquidity trap is where interest rates are low and savings are high, meaning that governments have less options to stimulate the economy again. And one of the recommendations that the author gives is that you should create inflation expectations but not actually create that inflation. So now the fourth chapter is called Asia's Crash, and this chapter is based on the devaluation of the baht, the currency of Thailand. Krugman talks about how it came to be this way and how Thailand was becoming dependent on foreign influence, and he just explains all of that in great detail. Their currency depreciated over 50% due to panic amongst investors, and because in the investors' minds the countries of Indonesia, Malaysia, Korea and Thailand were basically all the same, the crises started to spread to these countries. So that's what he looks into in this chapter. Chapter 5 is called Policy Perversity, and it's about the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus is 10 policies which North America has but they're desired by Latin America, and they're agreed by the IMF, the World Bank, and the US Treasury. And in Brazil in 1998, they followed this Washington Consensus, and this goes against neoclassical synthesis. So what neoclassical synthesis is, I had to look this up myself, was post-war macroeconomic development which combined Keynesian and classical theory. But Krugman calls this the Keynesian Compact. Basically, Brazil did this because it wanted to cater to the expectations and perceptions of investors and speculators, instead of actually fixing real economic problems. And it was because of this that recessionary effects started to appear. So the 6th chapter is called Masters of the Universe, and it talks about different stories. So it talks about the stories of George Soros, the founder of the Quantum Fund, the Malaysian Prime Minister during an attack on the Malaysian currency, an attack on the Hong Kong dollar, and how it was saved by limiting short selling. Short selling is also known as shorting, and you'll understand what shorting is if you watch The Big Short, which is a really good film, so I suggest that you watch that.
So now he's going to short the bonds, which means to bet against.
Anyway, but I find it really fascinating that he does this all in 20 pages. He goes into good detail, but he does it in 20 pages. Meaning that he's really concise in his writing, which is really interesting to read. Again, only 200 pages. It's a really good book to read, yet it's so short. He also talks about the Russian crisis and how hedge funds played a role in that. And he again talks about moral hazard. Moral hazard, if you don't remember, is when people take risks knowing that they don't have to bear the consequences. And it was about the Fed having to bail out, I think it was investors. This increased moral hazard because investors thought, okay, so we have the Fed to bail us out. It doesn't matter what we do. So that increased it. So that's chapter 6. Now chapter 7 is called Greenspan's Bubbles. So there was a man called Alan Greenspan, and he handled deflationary phases by reducing interest rates. Some claimed that this actually led to the stock bubble of the 2000s, which was then replaced by the housing bubble.
And then that happens.
What is that?
That's America's housing market.
So the 8th chapter is called Banking in the Shadows, and this talks about the history of banking and banking regulations. The shadow banking system is basically where banks, I do this because they're not actually banks, they're unregulated financial institutions which provide financial services, but obviously because they aren't regulated, they have much higher of a risk. Then chapter 9 is called The Sum of All Fears, and this is where it gets really juicy because it's about the 2008 financial crisis, and I think this book was published in 2008. Let's see. Yes, first in 1999 and then in 2008. Obviously, this is a really hot topic for Paul Krugman to write about at that time. But he talks about subprime mortgages.
These risky mortgages are called subprime.
Again, all covered in The Big Short, so literally just watch that film and you don't have to read this book. No, I'm kidding. He just talks about how it happens, and he says that this financial crisis was nothing like they ever saw before because it was a mixture of everything. So for example, the liquidity trap of Japan, shadow banking, and also the disruption of international capital flows, like with the Asian crises. Definitely, I think this chapter is very good to put at the end because it kind of concludes everything that you've read so far. It's kind of like a recap, which is quite good. It's not completely the last chapter, but it sums everything up and it builds towards the end. Then we have the 10th and final chapter called The Return of Depression Economics, which is a great name. But Krugman talks about how the world's economists started moving away from demand side to supply side, and he does not agree with that. And just going back to the fact that depression economics is not over. Basically what it is just a reduction in aggregate demand, and if you don't study economics, aggregate demand is, if I can remember, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So C is consumption, I is investment, G is government spending, X is exports, M is import. So the X minus M is like net trade. So when you have depression economics, it's just everything becomes like negative, or the value of AD is just really low. And then in the last few pages, he goes on to say that Keynes's ideas are much more important than ever at the moment. And he also talks about the fact that financial globalization is actually more dangerous than we think. So just a few thoughts. I think it's a very interesting book, provided you're interested in like depression economics, and it brings together a lot of concepts. He just ties things in from anywhere. So for example, like moral hazard, that kept coming up, and also the babysitting co-op. He uses that to try and make you relate, which is really interesting. But I still do think that you need some level of like economic study, whether that be A-level or above. I'm not sure what the GCSE syllabus is like, so perhaps GCSE would be okay. But definitely I think that this book supplements what I'm studying in class right now. It just goes well with everything, and again, I've said this like 2 times already, but it goes so well with The Big Short just because of depression economics. And I think that like in some places, yes, it supplemented my studies, but also I did need to look things up. So perhaps if you're looking to study economics or economics and management in university, economics and finance, anything with economics really, I think that to bridge the gap between A-levels and university, this book could be quite good for you, because you have all that knowledge from year 12 and 13, but you are yet to learn economics at university. So this book could be really good for that, and I think that I probably will reread this again once I've finished A-levels, just to like solidify the ideas in my head. But I think that at the moment it was a slight struggle for me to read, but not completely. Like I understood a lot of it, but I'd say that's because I'm studying A-level economics right now. So once I'm finished, I'll give it a reread, and hopefully it'll make a bit more sense then as well. So I kind of just waffled on a bit, but I hope that you enjoyed this video. If there's anything that you would like to see, please comment down below, DM me on Instagram, you know, just find me, contact me, give me your request, I'll see what I can do. Also, please like this video if you liked it, and if you haven't already subscribed, please do subscribe, and also hit the bell icon while you're at it. That way you'll never miss any of my videos, and YouTube will let you know when I've posted. So thank you again for watching, and goodbye.